The Future of the West, White Revolution, Brazilification, or Argentinization. By Colin Liddell. A wise man, presumably one sitting on a rock in a lotus position, once said, "Nothing is as difficult to predict as the future." Indeed, it is usually pointless to attempt it, except at the highest, macro level, where we can confidently say sweeping things like, the earth will eventually be swallowed by the sun, empires collapse, or democracy is unworkable in the not-so-long term. But despite the poor returns in terms of marketable facts, predicting the future is still worth attempting. Because it helps develop a certain kind of engaged consciousness that might one day manifest as willed control of our destiny, rather than passive acquiescence, the difference between being truly human and being an animal. One of the things that distinguishes the affirmative right from all other political and ideological movements is our readiness to contemplate this ever unreliable future. This is one of the reasons why we are the most humanistic of ideologies. Marxism, of course, had, via Hegel, a weird form of secularized millenarianism, essentially a passive faith, and a belief in a future economic utopia. In its present, new leftist incarnations, however, this outlandish futurology has dwindled to a nebulous state of mild optimism dependent upon ever-increasing intellectual ghettoization and reality denial. As for conservatism's futurology, this is simply an inversion of the past, filtered through conservative white dispossession. The 1950s, with Christian conservative Mexicans and jetpacks if you like. As likely as specific predictions are to be wrong, only a truly radical analysis is capable of seriously addressing the future. So what does our crystal ball say? Subtitle: Identitarian Future. First of all, we as a movement are ourselves a macro prediction. The affirmative right is predicated on the belief that politics, and thus history, will return to an identitarian basis. And that the conflict inherent in this will give rise to various forms of competitive hierarchy that will overthrow the lie of egalitarianism in most of its forms. In this general anticipation, our analysis, even in its short life, has not been proved wrong. Far from it. Things have moved, and continue to move, in an increasingly identitarian direction. The more that identity is denied by the mechanisms of the modern globalist West, the more it is seen to reassert itself at the grassroots level. But this is not even a conflict between ideologies. In its essence, it is a struggle between humanity and economics, between man and mechanism. Outside of certain manipulative elites, nobody, but a minority of mentally diseased whites, actually want the mass multicultural universalist egalitarian world enshrined in Western globalism. Rather than a vision, this is simply a materialistic compromise that comes from the limitations of mankind's first, post-Malthusian economic system. It is driven by the diminishing returns of an overextended capitalist system, seeking the near impossible profits and expansion of its glory days, and in the process being forced to consume itself. In short, the modern left are merely hangers-on of several economic factors: feminism, antinatalism, monetary laxness, foreign interventionism, welfarism, overregulation, mass immigration, etc. All phenomena that serve the function of artificial, short-termist economic stimulus and the temporary maintenance of profits at the cost of severe long-term socio-economic damage. With our superior foresight and readiness to at least contemplate the future, beyond the election cycle, we in the radical right see the lay of the land and perceive the dim outlines of the cliff edge our societies are collectively heading for. Already, the mere fact of growing multiculturalism on the social and cultural levels has created a marked upswing in identitarian politics across Europe and even America, the two centers of the globalist empire, not to mention a plethora of anti-globalist movements elsewhere in the world. What else is UKIP and France's Front National, and the ethnic sifting of U.S. voting patterns on the extremely low gradient provided by the marginal differences between Republican and Democratic parties. Not to mention ISIS, Boko Haram, the Bolivarian movements in South America, and the dominance of the BJP in India? The truth is, the globalist West was predicated on a core of secure white societies that did not need to question too closely their own ethnic identities, backed up by a margin of semi-colonial and petty dictatorial African and Latin American states. Also important was the comparative weakness, through command economy communism, of competing systems, the Soviet bloc and China. In other words, the world circa 1970. Those conditions have long since lapsed. Subtitle: The Benefits of Suicide. With regards to mass immigration and multiculturalism, there is, of course, some truth in the leftist case that it benefits those economies subjected to it. This is effected by increasing the population while decreasing the dependency ratio, increasing consumption and demand, and pushing up property prices. It also works by creating non-productive and therefore economically unfalsifiable jobs via the service economy, education, social work, police, and prisons, etc. And through strengthening central government's moral and political imperative to expand credit and spending. But such economic effects can rightly be compared to Rome deciding to employ barbarian hordes to defend its frontiers in the later empire period. Any benefits are extremely temporary, with massive long-term destructive consequences, merely the first course in a cannibal feast of self-consumption. But what will happen as those short-term benefits dissipate and the long-term disadvantages set in? At the macro level, the trajectory is clear, as is the fact that we are locked onto our present course. The rather drastic measures needed to alter course and rectify the situation cannot be made through our present social democratic political systems, awkwardly balanced coalitions of divergent interests, and a post-Christian morality bolstered by affluence. The best proof of this is the situation on the south coast of Europe. Here, migrant hordes are not only not resisted, but are actively assisted in invading Europe, with the various navies of the EU nations effectively serving as ferry services, because stopping these migrants would involve a little bit of brutality and unpleasantness. A similar example is seen in America's so-called amnesty cities and the ridiculous farce being played out at Calais, where those illegals who have made it to Europe are seeking out the yet lusher pastures of the UK. As much as the popular will favors clamping down on immigration, both in Europe and America, it is alas not ready to countenance the little bit of skull-cracking and the occasional drip-drip of tragic deaths that results from defending one's borders and disincentivizing invasion. The consequence of this is that thousands of tragic deaths are already happening in the Mediterranean every time an overloaded rust bucket sinks, before the EU's dedicated ferry service can reach it. As long as the phrase tragic deaths is widely used every time migrants die, trying to invade the West will continue to be invaded. But drastic measures not only require a more callous attitude to the migrants outside our societies, but also to those already here, who represent an unassimilated fast-breeding demographic time bomb. Even if the borders are secured, which is clearly unlikely for some time, the fundamental problems of growing ethnic and racial divisions will remain. The questions then are: what degree of immigration will be required to provoke a significant countervailing force? How socially disruptive will that countervailing force be, and will this inhibit its manifestation? What form will that force take? Subtitle: The Countervailing Force. Every society, even the most decadent and depraved, can be counted on to make some attempt at self-preservation. The Roman Empire and its rump successor state, the Byzantine Empire, exhibited a resilient statist life force. Both struggled long and hard, through centuries of decline, to maintain their power before finally collapsing. Even in its decline, the West can be expected to exhibit similar tendencies, and so vast is the superiority of the West, that there is even the possibility that it could revive itself through these processes, and even retain its global dominance in a changed form. There are two main possibilities of how the decline will be halted: white revolution or Argentinization, both terms that need explication. Outside of these two possibilities lie only increasing decline, colonization, and extinction. 1. White revolution. This is the idea most familiar to those on the alternative, radical, or dissident right. This means a mass racial awakening and the political definition and pursuit of white interests. The main problem with this option is that, under present conditions, it requires white countries to become saturated with large numbers of non-whites to take effect. In the case of America, there are a number of factors working against racial awakening. These include the universalist influence of Christianity, the interests of the Jewish lobby, white guilt, the comparative ease of racial self-segregation, American affluence, the relative limits on central government, etc. These factors mean that it may require whites to in fact become a minority before it occurs. In Europe, the possibility of a white revolution is heightened by the comparative weakness of Christian influence, the counter-Islamic nature of Jewish interests, and the stronger and more rooted ethnic identities of the countries threatened. There is also the relative incompatibility and hostility of the Muslims who form the bulk of the incomers, not to mention various economic factors. This suggests that a viable white revolution is possible at a much earlier stage in Europe than it is in America. This is important because a white revolution at a later stage faces additional obstacles. For example, in the hypothetical case of a future America, where whites were reduced to a minority and their power threatened, a white awakening and revolution would not go uncontested. It would thus raise the specter of significant instability, chaos, and economic collapse, which would act as a deterrent for people supporting this course, especially cozy middle-class whites. The main problem that the West has is that it is the center of a globalist economic system that radically inhibits the degree to which it can assert its own identitarian interests. The UK is perhaps the best example. Britain's post-industrial economy is now centered on the financial services, banking, insurance, commodities, money laundering, etc., of the City of London. The UK therefore relies on good relations with Middle Eastern oil sheikdoms and Commonwealth countries, amongst others. A white revolution that impacted adversely on its large and growing non-white population would threaten to severely damage the UK's web of economic relationships. The sudden economic damage this would create, therefore, incentivizes Britons to resist identitarianism and prolong multiculturalism, despite ever-increasing dissatisfaction with it. Countries like Germany, which produce quality exports, would be less susceptible to these negative pressures. For this reason, we can expect Britain to lag behind any identitarian awakening in Europe. 2. Argentinization. There is a relatively common idea that the future of America, and other parts of the West, will roughly follow that of Brazil, hence the term Brazilification, which is often heard. This essentially means that racial divisions will be replaced by subtle and imperceptible racial gradations, enabling the nation to avoid group polarization and retain a sense of loose unity. Even though the idea of Brazilification exists, it is at least to some degree mythical, serving to hide Brazil's very real ethnic divisions. America attaining the idealized state of non-divisive racial gradation denoted by the word seems unlikely, because America's racial divisions are deeply ingrained and heavily politicized. The main racial division, black versus white, has also become a template for further anti-white racial divisions, Hispanic versus white, Asians versus white, and even certain white ethnic groups versus white. These divisions are likely to remain, but rather than whites becoming an impotent minority and losing power, a more likely outcome is that white identity will retain its dominance and high status, while losing some of its purity. This is more or less what happened in Argentina, and is the reason why the Argentina is white meme has such power to amuse. In the case of the USA, some whites already are partially mixed, with elements of non-white races, such as Jews, Hispanics, Red Indians, etc. In the future, white or whitish Hispanics, some Middle Easterners, lighter mulattoes and mestizos, as well as some other groups, could, under the right circumstances, start to identify as white, thus bolstering the numbers of the dominant highest status group. As many Hispanics and Middle Easterners in the USA are Christian, Christianity also provides a cultural catalyst that can further this process. Transracialism, which usually involves special snowflake whites identifying as other races, could even start to flow the other way. The maintenance of a less pure, some would say polluted, white identity would provide a relatively stable dialectical solution to the contradictions of American identity politics. In this way, direct white disempowerment, severe racial rupture, or a series of partitions and civil wars that would rob America of its power could be avoided. Given the intense economic problems and sheer suffering that a purist racial rupture would involve, it must be conjectured that American state power will have a tendency to avoid this. Instead, it will flow towards the retention and conscious recognition of America's dominant historical white identity, combined with a certain degree of dilution and miscegenation of that identity. The America of the future is likely to be a largely white mongrel nation, in the same way that Argentina is. While there will continue to be genuine whites, there may also be a looser white identity that hides within it considerable mulatto and mestizo strains. In colonial Argentina, the proportion of Africans hovered around 50% in half the country's provinces. Also, due to the relative absence of women immigrants, there was considerable interbreeding with native Indian women. Yet today Argentina sees itself as 97% white. This pattern is much more likely to provide a useful template for America than Brazilification.